and I would like to welcome you all on behalf of ACTI to this live event, Paradox and Comparative Monasticism, Self and Society in the Middle Ages. I hope that, first of all, that you and your beloved ones are safe and healthy. And I also hope that this morning's conversation will give you time for deep reflection and meditation. Before we start, I would like to make a couple of technical announcements which will facilitate the flow of this live conversation. Please mute yourselves throughout the presentation. And just a reminder that this event is going to be recorded, and you'll be able to actually access this conversation later in the ACTI page if you want to go back and revisit it. There will be time to ask questions after all the three presentations are finished. But also, I would like to make the point that I would like to welcome both panelists and the audience to share comments or raise questions to our speakers in the chat window that we have in the Zoom window. Today, the Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination is honored to welcome our three panelists, and I would like to personally give this sense of gratitude to all three of them. First of all, we have Anna Harrison, who is an associate professor in the Department of Theological Studies here at LMU, where she teaches classes in pre-modern Christian thought and practice. Her book, Thousands and Thousands of Lovers, Sense of Community Among the Nuns of Helfta, concerns the ideas and attitudes about community of a highly intellectual household of visionary nuns who compose the largest collection of female author literature in the 13th century. She is also an active fellow, and she's working during her fellowship on her new book project called Paradox, Bernard de Clairvaux, on loving God and its influence. In the second place, we have Professor Eric Haruki Swanson, who received his undergraduate degree from Indiana University, Bloomington, his MA from Koyasan University in Japan, and his PhD from Harvard University. As a cultural historian, he's interested in the study of religious traditions through the examination of literature, visual material, ritual practices, and performance arts, and considers the role of religious institutions and its actors within broader cultural patterns, political agendas, and expressions of identity. His research focuses on the interactions between Buddhist institutions and the ruling class during times of political crisis and social unrest in pre-modern Japan. His current book project is a study of scholar Monk Yen, 1155 to 1225, and his establishment of esoteric Buddhist ritual programs for the pacification of vengeful spirits and the restoration of order in the medieval capital of Japan. Finally, Dermott J. Walsh, he received his PhD in Asian languages and cultures, Buddhist Studies track from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, with a dissertation on Myeon, Eisai, and the origins of Zen Buddhism in Japan. Dermott's research interest includes the relationship between precepts and meditation in Chanzen and Tiantai Buddhism, doctrine and practice in early Japanese Zen Buddhism, the nature of Buddhist ethics, Buddhist moral philosophy, and the history of philosophy in Asia. He has an undergraduate degree in Western philosophy and extensive experience in the Department of Japanese Philosophy at Kyoto University in Japan. And also, Dermott's work combines translation and textual analysis of pre-modern East Asian Buddhist texts with philosophical analysis. So a couple of months ago, when we were pitching this idea along with Anna Harrison as an active fellow, she presented the idea that these three presentations will create a space for interdisciplinary dialogue, which ACTI is a firm believer of interdisciplinarity, that illustrates how the notion of paradox can be viewed as a useful lens to analyze religious traditions in this pre-modern world. ACTI is really very interesting, not only in interdisciplinarity, but also in interreligious dialogue as a practical and fundamental way to create bridges of thinking through uncommon grounds. So let me just let you know a little bit of the order in which the presentations are gonna be made. First, we will ask Dermott Walsh, who will provide with an overview of the evolution and the significance of the concept of paradox in comparative philosophical and religious traditions. Next, Anna Harrison will take up the thought of Bernard of Clairvaux, a monk who exerted unparalleled influence on the intellectual developments of the 12th century Western Europe. And she will present an overview of his treatise on loving God with attention to the role of paradox in his conception of self and God. And last but not least, Eric Haruki Swanson will create an examination of the writing of Jian, a Buddhist monk and a poet entangled in the politics of court novels, focusing on his historical work, the Gukan Sho, probably I'm mispronouncing that, literally Jotings of a Fool, and he will consider how Yen addressed the paradoxical relationship between imperial authority and social order in medieval Japan. So without any further ado, Dermott Walsh, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here, and I hope everyone will be able to see it. There we go. First of all, I want to say a real thank you to ACTI. They took our ragtag study group, and thanks to Director Moreno, we got a home. And thanks to Emilu Reyes, we had a decoration of our home, and we now have an audience for our home. So we're very, very delighted that we have this opportunity, and thank you so much for facilitating this. So today I'm going to talk about, obviously, logic, paradox, and the religious experience. And basically, the argument will be that advances in modern logic allow us to view paradox not as a systematic logical problem that needs to be overcome, but rather allows us to see paradox as a transformative experience that is both logical and rational. And so this is going to be very briefly, obviously, the argument that I'm going to make here. And this is the structure of today's presentation. I will start by discussing the relationship between these related terms, logic, paradox, and rationality. They overlap in certain spheres, but also there are certain distinctions. Then I'm going to talk about the evolving nature of logic. Many of us probably don't realize that logic does evolve very, very slowly, it seems, but this will be the discussion of how that actually happens and how this evolution in logic allows us to see paradox in a new light. In particular, paradox in religious experience. I will suggest that these new developments in logic allow us to see a more enhanced version of how important and transformative paradox actually is in the context of religious experience. Without further ado, let's talk about this, the relationship between paradox, logic, and reasoning. I think first, paradox and logic. And logic, Aristotelian logic in particular, has been the bedrock of logical systems. This logic is basically designed to regulate language and its formal uses in argument. So when we encounter a contradiction between logical rules and the reality we experience, we often term this paradox. Now, paradox, as we know from our study group, covers a really huge number of potential areas. And here, I really want to discuss just one. And this idea of that logical rules and reality, when they conflict, we meet a paradox. But I will like to suggest here that if we expand our understanding of logic, then we can start to see that paradox is not something to be solved, but rather it's a challenge to encompass a more inclusive sense of rationality. And so when we encounter paradox in religion, we shouldn't consider it to be an irrational or illogical aspect that rules out any possible further logical argumentation. Not at all. And I hope this presentation kind of shows a little bit how this might be possible. Now, while these might look very simple, and we all know these three major rules of logic, it's worth looking at them again. The three that are kind of the cornerstone of Aristotle's logic are the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of excluded middle. And nobody that we're going to discuss in the next couple of slides, the different philosophers and logicians, none of them hold that these rules do not apply. That is not what anybody is arguing. But there have been movements in modern Western logic and also much older movements in Asian philosophical and religious cultures that basically argue or assert that these rules do not hold in all possible circumstances, that there are exceptions, and that those exceptions are found mostly in lived experience. The exceptions that we see that are paradoxical, that are arguments, like Zeno's paradoxes of motion, for example, are a different type of paradox. I think in a religious context, the paradox you encounter is one of experience. And here is where we have an issue where Aristotelian logic may not cover everything we need it to cover. In particular, the law of non-contradiction has been challenged in Asian Buddhism, but also I would say the law of identity is also something that is open to a challenge. Not in every circumstance, but in some circumstances. Obviously, bivalence has also been challenged. The law of excluded middle has also been challenged. And we will see these challenges now. Aristotle's logic is remarkably robust. It has lasted as the cornerstone of logical thought for almost 2,000 years, over 2,000 years. Aristotle's logic was designed to explicate the meaning of the syllogism, the idea that, for example, the argument, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is the syllogism. And the syllogism is surprising in that it can actually be expanded to include an awful lot of complex formal reasoning. But it does have the negative impact of making us assume that the world is in binary, true or false, basically being two extreme options. And so when we encounter a paradox, we have a tendency to dismiss it as illogical. But classical movements in Asian religious and philosophical cultures have, as well as movements in modern logic based on these, have challenged this perspective and have actually said that there are cases where Aristotelian logic does not work, and there are cases where we can actually change this formal system. And of course, I had to put Frege in here. He is one of the most important innovators in logic, although we don't really have a chance to talk about him. I want to call attention to a very unknown figure, Jan Lukasiewicz. He is, I believe, Polish, and I think he escaped during World War II. He settled in Ireland, and he wrote most of his most famous text in the botanical gardens in Dublin. Apparently, he was up in this tree house that he was sitting there every afternoon thinking about logic. And Lukasiewicz came up with a formal logical system where he demonstrates that truth and falsity are not extreme binary oppositions, but are actually representative of a scale of truth and falsity. And so he didn't just assert this. This is not a philosophical logic like a Hegelian logic, thesis and antithesis and synthesis. This is actually a formal system that Lukasiewicz created. So he argues then that there is an intermediate truth value, that when you're making a formal system, you can have truth, you can have false, you can have T, F, and then I in the middle. So he says that actually this is more representative of how reality is. And I think we all kind of intuitively know this. This system has been built on by a very, very interesting group of philosophers, experts on Buddhism, logicians, led by people like Graham Priest and Jay Garfield, who have advocated for what is called dialetheism, the idea that in some situations, a contradiction or a paradox can actually be assigned a truth value. You can say this paradox is true in this system. So it's a very interesting. So for me, what's interesting about this is how it relates to religious experience. We have seen that Asian philosophers and religious practitioners have also known about formal logical systems. We should not think that logic is only a Western category. But the way in which paradox and logic have been treated in Asian cultures has been very different. It's been incorporated as a transformative aspect. This makes it very difficult for us who are schooled in European American thought when we encounter Asian texts, like this quote, for example, from Dogen, Zen Master Dogen. It might seem paradoxical or illogical to us, but only because we are trained to see such statements as illogical and paradoxical. An Asian Buddhist looking at this statement would not find it at all paradoxical, or if it were considered paradoxical, they would not have a problem with that. It would be seen as a positive aspect. And so we have a tendency when we read Asian texts to project our very rigid sense of logic onto the text, and we should be careful, I think, in doing that. But moreover, when we are describing or studying or researching religious experience, I think it's important to understand that paradoxes are not illogical and imitable to reason. There are frameworks that will allow us to express how this logical, paradoxical experience is also a rational experience. And I think in the papers that we have today, we see this in action. We see that Dr. Swanson is going to highlight how for GN, the external world does not correspond to the ritual reality carefully constructed to legitimize political and religious power. So GN is faced with a paradox, and his answer is to actually advocate for more advanced, hypercharged ritual technology. And so that's how he faces the paradox, a paradox of external reality, something that we, I think, in America in the last few years have also faced somehow. And then Dr. Harrison will explain the kind of really in-depth, sedimented, structural paradox that is really at the core of Bernard of Clairvaux, such an interesting figure, because he is not afraid to approach directly the nature of these paradoxes. The most obvious one being, how can an imperfect human access this perfect God? And so these are the conclusions, as I've mentioned. Paradox in religion is not a logical failure. It's actually a crucial, I would argue, element in some senses, a crucial element that forces us to open our minds. And that formal logic is changing to embrace the fact that paradox is a central element of lived experience, is something to be welcomed. And I think it enhances our study of both philosophy and of religious and theological questions. So that's it from me. And thank you very much for your attention. I very much appreciate it. And now I will hand you off to the capable hands of Dr. Harrison, who is going, I believe, to bring us more in-depth knowledge of St. Bernard.
Well, thank you so much, Dermott. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning. Special thanks, of course, to the Academy for Catholic Thought and Imagination for this panel and for a fellowship that has allowed me to move forward with my book project. In Paradox, Bernard of Clairvaux on Loving God and its Influence, I offer a close reading of a 12th century monastic treatise on loving God to reveal the web of paradoxes at its core. Today, I outline my book and I focus on aspects of its chapter on paradox. First, let me introduce you to Bernard. Bernard of Clairvaux was among the Middle Ages' most creative thinkers, exerting wide-ranging influence on the institutional and intellectual developments that characterized Western Europe's 12th century Renaissance. This was a period of social and cultural revitalization characterized by optimism about the mind's ability to explore and to map the physical world, as well as the interior landscape, and optimistic too about the person's likeness to God and capacity to return to Him. Its spirituality charged with psychological inquisitiveness and sensitivity. This was also an era of repression and persecution, rife with misogyny and attacks on Jews, so-called heretics, lepers, as well as prostitutes and homosexuals. Bernard was a man of his age. Paradox was a defining feature of his life and at the heart of his thought. An abbot who poured out tender expressions of longing for God and wrote one of the most searching defenses of grief in the Middle Ages, Bernard was caustic in criticizing practices of his fellow monks. Heartily expounding on the testimony of conscience in the life of each Christian, he was merciless in his denunciation of opponents he charged with heresy. Author of the statement that it is easier to raise the dead than to be in a room with a woman and not wish to commit fornication, Bernard championed the visionary nun and polymath Hildegard of Bingen, promoting unprecedented female participation in the public life of the medieval church. Aware of the paradox inherent in his own predicament as a monk committed to retreat from the world while maneuvering in papal politics, engaging in theological disputation, and preaching the Second Crusade, a sense of irreconcilable two-ness inflected Bernard's self-understanding. "I have become the chimera of my age," he exclaimed, a reference to the sculpture, half human, half animal, that adorned many Romanesque church and cloister columns, a monster that filled him with revulsion. Advocate of the ascetic life, Bernard composed among the most sumptuous and sensuous texts of the Middle Ages, in which hybrids and opposites abound, and in which paradox emerges as a driving force, animating his virtually every major reflection. A treatise of roughly 30 printed pages on loving God presents stages in the individual's advancement toward God. Bernard assumes a sunny stance about this potential progress, which he envisages as culminating in an experience of God that belongs to only a few in this life and which is the bliss of the saved in heaven. My book is in 4 chapters. Chapter 1 is a brief biography of Bernard, emphasizing his sense of self as monstrous. Chapter 2 reviews the entirety of On Loving God, moving sequentially through its several parts, with special attention to the meaning of love in this treatise. My book's 3rd chapter lays bare paradox as a governing theme in the treatise and intrinsic to its most fundamental claims. In a 4th chapter, I review aspects of On Loving God's reception history with attention to its place in the medieval mystical tradition, within early modern Christian controversies, and in the context of a 20th century resurgence of interest in Bernard, with particular emphasis on his writings on love, captivating a range of thinkers from French feminist psychoanalyst Julia Kristeva to the Midwestern monk Thomas Merton. I want to spend the remainder of my time now on the place of paradox in On Loving God. And I start with two preliminary remarks. First, as Dermott has taught us, paradox is itself an equivocal notion. And I keep in mind as I work various examples and definitions of paradox and a notion of paradox as attitude or orientation. Consider the following example of paradox, words attributed to Christ. Those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. As a definition of paradox, I offer theorist Matthew Bagger's observation, quote, when one describes a statement as paradoxical, one generally perceives it as in some sense self-contradictory, but to some extent compelling nonetheless, close quote. Modern intellectuals often point to paradox as a mark of the creative thinker committed to upending habitual ways of perceiving reality so as to make room for surprise. Thus, in the 19th century, Kierkegaard, surely with himself in mind, wrote, quote, paradox is the source of the thinker's passion, and the thinker without a paradox is like a lover without feeling, a paltry mediocrity, close quote. A second preliminary consideration. As I take up my topic, I do so aware that to ask about paradox is always to ask paradox for whom. Thus, there may be to us a kind of paradox in Bernard's relentless emphasis on love, coupled with his preaching the Second Crusade and support of an order of warrior monks trained to kill as well as to contemplate. This is not paradoxical to Bernard, however, for whom the crusade was an expression of love for God. Let me now turn to paradoxes in On Loving God, to which Bernard himself does bring our attention. And I'll make four observations now. First, paradox and the search for God. Bernard turns upside down on Loving God's preoccupation with the self's movement to God when, addressing God, Bernard discloses the paradox at the center of the search he charts and champions, writing, "No one can seek you who has not already found you." Bernard thus undergirds his description of the love undertaking about which he writes with a claim to confidence that sustaining the person's effort is an already established purchase in God. Unloving God should therefore be read as Bernard's urging his readers at once to strive toward and to recognize what is already. We search for God even as he is already present to us, a claim fundamental to Bernard's sense of the person as ignorant of her own reality and of the gradual unveiling of that reality accompanying growth in love of God, and reflective of Bernard's broader concern with the paradoxical simultaneity of God's presence and absence to us. Second, paradox and the self. Sin-soaked and vile, the human being at the center of Bernard's treatise is also God's most glorious creation. The treatise reckons with human wickedness, cataloging it. We are ignorant, unappreciative, and prideful. Bernard groans over our fixedness in the sludge of sinfulness. He also highlights our similarity to God, acclaims our rationality, and celebrates our virtue. Crucial to divesting ourselves of sin is both an awareness of the depth of our wickedness and a willingness to wonder at and to give thanks for what we are. The self is frankly paradoxical, and recognition of this is to Bernard necessary to salvation. Bernard's sense of the self as paradoxical is at play, in addition, when he turns to the body. Vulnerable and ever in need of food to eat and air to breathe and light to see and more, body tugs on the soul, who is driven to serve her good and faithful companion, providing body with basic self-care that is sometimes what Bernard means by love. Body's pleas are a training ground for the soul, teaching her patience. And body is also access to God, or can be, when in imitation of Christ's passion, we mortify our flesh. Bernard acknowledges simultaneously that the body's needs drag the soul down, and he sounds an alarm on a love for the body that is excessive, allowing its desires free play as it plunges into pleasures that distract us from God. Third, paradox and desire. To Bernard, desire is a greed for acquisition that knows no bounds, a continuous chasing after the highest and the best. It is a breeding ground for discontent. Recalling the relentless building and renovation frenzy of contemporary Los Angeles and New York, to my fellow New Yorker who just arrived, he wrote about the 12th century. Today, you see those who have houses worthy of a king and vast palaces, nevertheless adding house to house every day and building with a relentless love of novelty, altering rectangles to rounds. He continues, he who loves money will not be satisfied by money, one expression among many of desire as a circle that goes round and round, never ceasing its wanderings. If we were able to meet all our desires, and we cannot, Bernard says, life is too short, we would learn that their satisfaction does not, after all, satisfy. The hunger of desire cannot be sated, and it can. For Bernard's counsel is not that we should strive to still desire, and this is because desire is also a gift, which causes in the soul a longing love that draws us to God, fueling a search that triggers the revelation that God is present to us. Desire thus distracts us from God, and it is at the heart of the search for God. A different sort of paradox of desire is alive in heaven, furthermore, where fulfillment of the soul's desire for God is a fanning of the very desire it fulfills. This is a longing that never abates and which carries with it no sense of lack, about which Bernard writes, straining under the force of paradox, it is a sober intoxication. 4, paradox and loving God. Paradoxes abound when Bernard turns to focus more directly on the love relationship between the self and God. Thus, we read that God's love for us is a gift for which we are, however, indebted to God because he is deserving of our love, in part for having loved us when we did not deserve his love. Yet our love for God, Bernard insists, is freely given. Moreover, God, to whom we owe everything and who owes us nothing, is indebted to us for our love for him. Foundational to Bernard's thought about the indebtedness associated with love are two related notions. The first is that love is attractive. It calls forth an answering response. And Bernard sometimes conceives of this response to love as a duty, in the sense that it is experienced as a command, something like a love summons that is intrinsic to what he calls the law of love, and which is to him the animating principle of the universe, and under which God himself necessarily operates. Second, love to Bernard deserves reward. This is because love cannot be empty. It is generative. God's reward for loving us is our love for him, and our reward for loving God is God's love for us. Indeed, our reward, Bernard almost seems to want to say, is the very love by which we love God, since he quotes scripture, God is love. Thus, to Bernard, loving really is its own reward. This brings us finally to an additional and related paradox, which is that God and the human being are one, and they are two. Bernard insists that the love by which we love God is God himself, and it is us. Because God is love, when we repay him for this gift of love, we are returning what he has given us, his very self. And what we return to God is our very self, for according to Bernard, who we are is who and how we love. Moreover, as Bernard relates, becoming the love that we give, our will conforms to God's will, and so we love him as he loves. Thus, as Bernard writes, in heaven, quote, our weak human love will be changed into divine love, and to love in this way is to become like God. In this context, Bernard writes of the self in heaven disappearing into God, like a drop of water disappears into wine, becoming indistinguishable from it. And he insists that the self remains itself for all eternity. With his eye on last things, Bernard quotes scripture, insisting that God cannot be all in all if anything of the human being remains in the human being, and immediately he asserts the substance of the human person perdures eternally. Thus, to Bernard, eternity is home to a reality marvelous beyond our comprehension, in which we really do change while remaining ourselves, and in which each of us does and does not become God. Bernard finally will not let go of the two-ness he trumpets, God and self, but neither does he wholly concede separateness between God and the self that is saved. Let me conclude. Medieval Christianity is shot through with paradox. At its center is a virgin who gave birth to her creator, and a God-man who overcame death by dying. Almost every Christian in the Middle Ages is attentive to these categorizations and others, underscoring paradoxes, hybrids, and oppositions. Paradox, however, plays at the center of Bernard's thought in a way with perhaps few parallels among pre-modern Christian thinkers. His rhetoric routinely making opposites confront each other in order to heighten oppositions. This habit of confrontation makes use of paradox in at least three often overlapping ways. First, paradox is part of Bernard's strategy to jostle the reader out of his settled attitudes in order to provoke an emotional response, charging him with the fear and hope conducive to self-transformation. Second, paradox highlights God's unknowability. And third, paradox is truth disclosing, because in Bernard's perception, reality really is paradoxical. With that, I thank you for your attentiveness, and I have the real pleasure of introducing my colleague, Eric Swanson, who speaks to us about paradox in a very different, while simultaneously somewhat similar context, as he takes us to 12th century Buddhist monasticism in Japan with Jen. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you so much, Anna, and to Dermott for both of your really wonderful presentations. I'm going to share my PowerPoint here. And okay, so I'm going to. This is my. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I want to first thank ACTI for this opportunity to speak with all of you, and especially to Jose and Emilu for the support in making this event possible. Thank you so much for your help on this. And I also wanted to send a special thanks to Anna, who, as the recipient of the ACTI Fellowship, kindly invited Dermott and me to join her today to address the issue of paradox in the Middle Ages. So the three of us in the Theological Studies Department here at LMU started a medieval monasticism study group last spring, just weeks before the campus closed in response to the pandemic. We've been able to keep it going via Zoom, and I'm so thankful that we have this opportunity today to share what we've been working on to everybody here. I see a few familiar faces and names, so thank you for being here. So we're hoping that today's panel will be the first of many to follow. In fact, we're planning on another panel on paradox in the Middle Ages in the spring that will be a further elaboration on the topics that we're all discussing today, hopefully with additional speakers. It's our hope that the medieval monasticism study group that we started and the panels that come out of it will create a space for productive and stimulating exchange among scholars studying different religious traditions and focusing on the Middle Ages, however that may be understood within their field of study. I certainly learned so much from our work together, so I look forward to keeping it going. So if you're interested in connecting about the study group or the upcoming panel in the spring, please do feel free to contact me at eric.swanson@lmu.edu, which I have on the screen, and it's available on the website as well. So let me begin with my presentation. So the figure that I'll focus on today is the Buddhist monk Jian, who's a fascinating figure active around the turn of the 13th century with, I think, interesting parallels to Bernard. Dermott just described paradox as a contradiction between logical rules and the reality that is experienced. Today, I hope to think about these kind of logical rules and the reality that informed Jian's actions in his society. With Anna's fascinating presentation, while Anna's fascinating presentation was on the issues of paradox and the self through Bernard, I hope to introduce Jian as a religious figure concerned with the paradoxical reality in which he lived. So in modern scholarship, Jian is often presented first and foremost as the author of the Gukansho, literally the jottings of a fool. The Gukansho is often described as the first interpretation of Japanese history told through the lens of Buddhist thought, and often presented as a work of great intellect and historical insight. One of the first articles written in Jian in English was by Charles H. Hambrick in 1978, in which he describes Jian's unique contribution as characterizing knowledge as historical, claiming that Jian's work was, quote, neither speculative nor metaphysical, neither an intuitive awakening nor a paradoxical enlightenment experience. This knowledge is very practically rooted in Japanese man's historical existence, end quote. Michele Mara, in his article from 1985, The Conquest of Mappo, focused on how Jian incorporated the notion of Mappo, or the degenerate age of Buddhist teachings, arguing that Jian's use of these Buddhist concepts of decline in the Gukansho shows that the treatise addressed, quote, a wise man who had the ability of sensing the course of history through the personal intuition and of choosing the right principles, according to his Buddhist knowledge and moral purity, end quote. So in both Hambrick and Mara's assessment, morality and intellect are highlighted as the most important aspects of Jian's interpretation of history in the Gukansho. However, Jian, far from the modernized intellectual that scholars have imagined him to be, I believe is a much more enigmatic and quite paradoxical figure that requires a critical rereading not only of the Gukansho itself, but also of how this text relates to his broader religious and ritual activities. In fact, a closer look at how the Gukansho as a text relates to his broader ritual activities indicate that the text is not only expresses a fundamental concern of the growing precariousness of imperial authority and aristocratic society, which has already been pointed out by many scholars, but also that Jian's view of the growing disorder in the capital that he lived in included a serious consideration of the influence of invisible evil spirits that were causing the acceleration of the capital's decline. It's also important to highlight that Jian was an extremely active practitioner of various forms of Buddhist rituals. He served in the highest position of the Tendai Sammon school, a Buddhist school, and the 4-time abbot of Endyakuji on Mount Hiei. He performed Buddhist rites designed to seize calamities and maintain peace in the world, and performed rites to pray for the health and prosperity of members of the imperial and aristocratic families of the capital. Perhaps most importantly, he succeeded in establishing a strong relationship with retired Emperor Gotoba, the de facto ruler of the Heian capital, serving as his personal protector monk, or gojiso. So his role as a guardian of peace and order through the practice of Buddhist rituals can also be seen as reflected in his posthumous title, Jichin Kasho, which literally means the priest of compassionate pacification, referring to the pacification rituals that he performed. And yet, throughout his life, Jian was faced with the undeniable reality that the imperial and aristocratic culture of the capital that he was responsible for protecting was entering into a period of decline and growing precariousness. The sense of urgency is clearly expressed in the Gukansho. When explaining his motivations for composing this historical treatise, Jian emphasizes the necessity of recognizing the reality of the age of chaos in which they lived, critiquing previous historical treatises for not adequately addressing the negative trajectory of court culture. Jian specifically points to the Hogen Rebellion as the start of these chaotic times, which he sees as marked by the rise of the military clans that led to unprecedented violence and disorder occurring in the immediate proximity of the Heian capital that we see depicted here many years later. The Hogen Rebellion of 1156 was a short-lived civil war fought in order to resolve a dispute about imperial succession. The Heiji Rebellion of 1160, occurring just a few years later, was yet another short civil war between rival subjects of the then retired Emperor Go Shirakawa, which was fought to resolve a dispute, again, of political power. These two events were the beginning of a chain of events that would produce the first samurai-led governments, the Kamakura Shogunate, 1185. Furthermore, the Gukansho was composed around the year 1220, just before the advent of the Jokyu Rebellion of 1221, in which the retired Emperor Gotoba, to whom Jian served as a personal protector, attempted to overthrow this Kamakura shogunate. His forces were quickly quelled, and the retired Emperor Gotoba was exiled to Oki Islands, far from the capital, from which he never returned. The repercussions of the actions by retired Emperor Gotoba were harsh, with many of his family members also exiled from the capital. So for Jian, the historical events that led to the rise of the Kamakura shogunate and the eventual banishment of the retired Emperor Gotoba were all clear signs of the growing precariousness of imperial authority and its growing inability to maintain peace in the land. Herein lies the greatest paradox for Jian. How could it be that the capital under the rule of the imperial family, legitimized as direct descendants of the kami, or gods of the heavens, and whose authority to govern was reinforced through court rituals of ascension, succession, and renewal over generations, be so wrought with chaos and disorder? There was a clear disconnect between the notion of imperial authority as the ideal sovereign and arbiter of peace and the historical reality of the precariousness of the court culture that was unfolding right before his eyes. The Gukansho, therefore, was a treatise that was written to overcome this paradoxical reality and to imagine a way forward that would restore the legitimacy of the imperial authority. What is important to highlight, however, is that Jian did not only rely on historical knowledge, intellect, and morality to address this issue, as scholars like Hambrick may have suggested before. In fact, it's precisely in the Gukansho where Jian elaborates on how the growing influence of vengeful spirits has led to the growing precariousness of imperial authority in the capital. According to Jian, because vengeful spirits have a natural propensity to cause disorder, the Hogan Rebellion was a sign that the influence of the, what he calls, principle of vengeful spirits, or onryo no dori, was growing stronger. Importantly, the only way this disorder could be countered was through the principles of the Buddhist teachings, which Jian describes as, quote, removing evil and grasping the good. In this way, Jian's emphasis on the principle of vengeful spirits as diametrically opposed to the good principles of the Buddhist teachings and practices were central to his justification that it was his ritual program alone that would serve to counter chaos and eventually reestablish order in the capital. As a Buddhist ritual practitioner concerned not only of the care of the physical bodies of the members of the imperial family, but also the well-being of the social political realm over which the emperor reigned, Jian viewed the world through two overlapping lenses. One that focused on the historical reality of the rise of the rivaling military class that directly challenged the authority of the imperial and aristocratic families of the Heian capital, and the other that perceived the world in terms of a conflict between good and evil spirits, in which the gradual expansion of evil spirits were presented as responsible for the decline of imperial order. These two modes of interpretation, one which we might categorize today as the historical lens concerned with shifting political powers in the human realm, and the other, the religious lens concerning the conflicts of the unseen supernatural realm, were, for Jian, inseparable perspectives of a single reality marked with a growing awareness of impending social disorder. And both of these perspectives, importantly, were Jian's way of responding to what he considered to be the paradox of imperial authority. Furthermore, the solution he envisioned was needed to overcome this paradox was directly related to the establishment of a Buddhist ritual program in the proximity of the Heian capital. So this is a map of the Heian capital, and the red circle is where Jian established his temple. So it's not technically within the borders of the capital, but in the proximity of this urban space. So it was in the years ranging from 1202 to 1222 that Jian worked toward establishing a new ritual center in the region just east to the capital, a temple called, which was eventually called the Temple of Great Repentance. When Jian started the construction of these structures in 1206, he composed the articles regarding the establishment of the Temple of Great Repentance, which included a vow explaining how Jian envisioned the role of the different architectural structures for the practice of Buddhist rituals. In this vow, we see a strong emphasis on the issue of social disorder and its relationship to the issue of vengeful spirits. Jian says, quote, ever since the Hogan Rebellion until this very day, it has been chaotic times. The vengeful spirits have permeated the heavens, and the dead soldiers occupy the four seas. I have yet to hear of a virtuous form of governance that could help liberate those from their suffering. There is no sign of a revival of court ceremonies. Therefore, in spring dreams, crimson tears flow down from my sleeves, and in autumn slumber, my bare heart inflames my chest. The only thing that could liberate these vengeful spirits and bolster the court is through the power of the Buddha Dharma, end quote. Just as in the Gukansho, Jian claims here that the rise of the military clans was not only a political issue, but the result of an imbalance between good and evil principles that govern the world. Furthermore, we see Jian clearly state that it's not only through the establishment of his own Buddhist ritual program that can assist in pacifying the vengeful spirits, thereby restoring legitimacy and authority of imperial court. Jian's ritual program, in other words, is precisely what he called the principle of the Buddhist teachings that he explained in the Gukansho, which he described again as removing evil and grasping the good. To get a better sense of how this principle of the Buddhist teachings were put into practice through Jian's ritual program, we can turn to a treatise titled The Commentary on the 15 Deities of the Hall of Repentance. And we see this Hall of Repentance in this blue circle right here. Here, Jian provides a brief commentary on the 15 different Buddhist deities who occupy the ritual space of this temple hall. In this commentary, we see Jian re-envision how each of the Buddhist figures helped to alleviate the suffering of vengeful spirits. It is worth noting that the issue of how Buddhist deities assist in the salvation of vengeful spirits is not discussed in Buddhist scriptures and can be seen as an important innovation of doctrine and practice that occurred through Jian's attempt to address the issue of disorder in the capital. So just to provide one example of this re-envisioning of the Buddhist deities, I want to introduce Jian's views on the immovable wisdom king that we see depicted here, or the Fudo Myo-o. The immovable wisdom king is a wrathful figure important in Japanese esoteric Buddhism. Jian first highlights elements of this deity that are often seen in esoteric Buddhist scripture, describing this deity as endowed with the ability to subjugate both inner and outer obstructions through the recitation of mantra, the chanting of the name of a Buddhist deity. In the context of esoteric Buddhist rituals, obstructions refer to both the thoughts in the mind of a practitioner that prevent them from attaining enlightenment, but also visualized as rebellious deities who defy the Buddhist teachings and therefore need to be subdued. In the discussion of the immovable wisdom king in the context of Jian's ritual program, this deity's ability to subjugate obstructions is reinterpreted as also applicable to vengeful spirits. Jian explains, quote, because the eyes of compassion of the manifested form of the immovable wisdom king sees all sentient beings as equal, he saves vengeful spirits and the souls of dead by treating them as if they were his only child. The subjugation of evil demons and vengeful spirits ultimately lead them toward the path to enlightenment. And through this, it is possible to destroy the delusions of the land. It will certainly open the gates to virtuous governance. The merits obtained through the sword and rope of the immovable wisdom king is none other than the removal of evil and the grasping of the good. It is the prayers of the lords, ministers, and the people that will bring forth victory in the present and in the future. End quote. Not only does Jian claim that the function of the immovable wisdom king is to subjugate evil that can be applied to vengeful spirits that plague the capital, but he also clearly makes the point that it is precisely through the pacification of these evil spirits that will lead to the restoration of a virtuous governance. Jian also comments that the iconographical features of this deity, the sword of wisdom in his right hand and the rope in his left, are visual expressions of the very notion of this removal of evil and grasping the good, a term Jian specifically highlights both in his historical treatise Gukansho, as well as his stated vows for the establishment of the temple. Furthermore, Jian concludes in this section by suggesting that the immovable wisdom king is the very embodiment of the principle of the Buddhist teachings, which must be followed to counter the principle of vengeful spirits. In other words, it's through these commentaries that we see an active reinterpretation of the iconography, functions, and activities of these Buddhist figures in a way that specifically point to the ritual pacification of vengeful spirits as a solution for the problem of disorder. So in conclusion, a consideration of this intertextuality of Jian's historical work of the Gukansho, his stated vows, the commentary of the 15 Buddhist deities, as well as ritual practices at his temple, provide us with a far richer understanding of Jian's own conception of the world around him as one populated by evil, vengeful spirits that needed to be confronted and pacified through the Buddhist ritual practice. In fact, it was particularly in the manner in which Jian highlighted the paradox of imperial authority seen in the growing precariousness of the capital that allowed Jian to claim the necessity of his own Buddhist ritual program in his effort to reestablish order for the future of the capital. Importantly, the removal of evil for Jian was also informed by Buddhist ideals of universal salvation, in which the ritual pacification was conceptualized as having a soteriological goal of guiding vengeful spirits to eventually attain their own enlightenment. By viewing Jian in this light, examining his activities through the lens of paradox and placing him within the historical context of 13th century Japan, new aspects of Jian's face may be revealed to us as one who, in his own historical reality, attempted to counter the growing chaos in the world through the ritual innovation and religious imagination, and instructing his disciples to confront the evils of their world with Buddhist discourses of salvation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this exquisite presentation. Our three panelists with the depth and engaging ideas that came forward. I'm looking forward also to this summit that is going to take place next year, and hopefully ACTI will be able also to encourage and provide some support as always, because this is just so engaging. So we are going to move into our Q&A. You're welcome to actually just place your question, just turn on your microphone, or you can actually write it in the chat and I'll read it for you. I'll just start by breaking the ice and probably just make an observation and a question, if you don't mind. And it's just so engaging to see it also, myself being a storyteller and an image maker, that there's something that I found in the images as you were actually talking, which by the way, I'm going to share something that Anna actually sent me this morning, which is the image of the Chimera. And I was wondering, in terms of the paradox, it seems to me that there's like this almost epic brutality in terms of the visual representation of wisdom, almost like the description in the Bible of angels, which are not at all, a beautiful description, is like they are terrifying, and especially with the. Sorry if I correct my pronunciation, please, Eric. The blue fudo migo. It's just like the immovable wisdom king. That is just like this. There's this brutality in the necessity of bringing forward this wisdom. And if you actually think that paradox, the way in which paradox is also reflected in visual representation, if you have actually thought about that, if you have discussed in your monastic group in terms of the aesthetics of the paradox. So this is a question for all of you, for the three of you.
Eric, do you want to start?
Sure. Since Fudomyo came up in the question, I think I'd love to respond to that. Thank you so much for the question. We actually haven't had a chance to talk about paradox with that perspective, but I think that would be such an interesting thing to consider. And for my presentation today, I focused on kind of the paradox that Jian sees in kind of his social reality. But I think once you step into the kind of the logic of the esoteric Buddhist ritual system, there is quite a lot of paradox that it engages with very significantly. And I think in terms of the epic brutality in bringing forth the wisdom, as you put it, I think it really resonates with what these esoteric rituals are grappling with. And there's a very important text, the Sutra of the Mahavairochana, where the wisdom, there's a question of what is wisdom? What is ultimate wisdom? And the answer is the ultimate wisdom is the wisdom of realizing that you are none other than the Buddha, but also that that's also connected with all other sentient beings. So it's not only a relationship between you and the enlightened figure, but you with everything else, including those who are the rebellious beings, the kind of grotesque monsters who do not want or are not they're not interested or invested in maintaining enlightenment. So in this kind of esoteric ritual worldview, there's a certain kind of process in which you subdue, or you have to forcibly subjugate the rebellious beings in order for everybody to attain enlightenment, because it's only when everybody attains enlightenment that true enlightenment is manifested. And I think just, in words, that is highly paradoxical in many ways, but I think there, like Dermott was saying, there's a certain logic, ritual logic to it as well. So those are my initial responses to that, but thank you for the fascinating question.
So there are many directions in which I could take the question. So I'll just say three basic oppositions. observations, actually maybe 4. To Bernard, some oppositions, or you might say paradoxes, are utterly horrifying, and some are marvelous beyond comprehension. He identifies himself as a horrifying monster of opposing parts, a chimera. And by the way, he wrote a scathing indictment of the new art appearing in cloisters of his period, and attacked many features of its adornment as presenting a distraction for monks and nuns meant to turn inward. And among this, the art of which he was critical was this feature, the chimera, which, as I mentioned, adorns many cloister and church columns in Romanesque art, the art of his period. But the basic point is that some oppositions or paradoxes are to him horrifying and some marvelous beyond compare. The other thing I want to say in terms of brutality as a way of, I don't know, getting at both, let's say, contemplatively and in act wisdom. So understanding and expressing, you might say, I really see the focus on brutality. I right away think of 13th century, so a century after Bernard, when the relentless focus in Christian art and literature is on the suffering of Christ crucified, which, as we travel up a century into the 14th, becomes a kaleidoscope of colors saturated with expressions of pain. And it's exactly through this tortured, broken body, with which we are meant, you might say, to empathize through the logic of compassion, that we come to learn among the greatest teachings from the perspective of medieval Christians that they have to offer in the 13th and 14th century, which is a way of considering what Eric has said, which is that identification with wisdom itself, identified in medieval Christian tradition with God, comes about through suffering with him, which necessarily implies a suffering with all who suffer. So, you know, one of the reasons I might say, if Eric and Dermott will give me a moment, is that one of the reasons we wanted to engage in this medieval monasticism group and consider the topic of paradox, because we thought paradox was a nice way of respecting and highlighting differences, which are so real among what you might call various philosophical and religious traditions, while making space to perceive overlap and similarity. So I just mentioned that, at least I think that's what part of what's animating the three of us to work together on this topic.
Thank you. There is a question for Dermott from Bob Hurto. I don't know if you read it, Dermott.
I have read it. Yes, I've been contemplating this very difficult question. You know, I do see the encounter with paradox in religious experience as being not a negative element. Now, this, of course, brings us to a very tricky situation about Aristotle's logic. And I think the way to see Aristotle's logic is to see it as a foundational, like a basic roadmap, like the foundations for a house almost. But how you decorate your house is another thing, and which direction you build upon that foundation is another thing. And one of the major problems with Aristotle's logic is that it makes us think the world corresponds to the way statements work. And it doesn't necessarily happen that way. So I actually think the important developments in modern logic that are actually allowing us to feel like paradox can be something legitimate in terms of something that can also be true is also applicable to science. I think if we look at the quantum level, we see Aristotelian logic does not work. Identity even doesn't work. So we have a situation where both science and religion, which have often been in conflict with each other concerning issues surrounding paradox and logic, can actually find a way where both, I think, can coexist more peacefully and more productively by looking at the fact that paradox is not something that we just find in statements. We also find it in experience, and we also find it in the world. And so I think not just for religious context, but Aristotle's logic needs to be considered not a rarefied system that cannot be overcome. It is not a closed system. It's a system that can be expanded and developed upon. It doesn't mean that we never use it. It just means that when we encounter its limits, we don't need to feel like we have failed logically. In fact, it's an invitation to go beyond that. You know, I often think about the social issues that are facing us in this world. You know, the binary idea of male and female has been challenged, for example, and we're seeing it play out in a very applicable, practical way, how these doctrines of intensity, of truth and falsity, are not necessarily not only helping us understand the world, they're actually maybe not even good for us. So perhaps we need to see how Aristotelian logic is more a tool that has a more limited application than perhaps we originally thought. I think it's scary to think that way. And, you know, I've been studying dialetheism, Graham Priest's doctrines for many years, and trying to understand how they work formally, and, you know, finding my own opinions about this changing very drastically. And there have been critiques of this, a critique of Aristotelian logic. One of the most famous is Edmund Husserl's Logical Investigations, where he argues if you don't have Aristotelian logic as a hard and fast rule, we end up with just psychological rules. Anyone can apply any logic they want. So this is not an easy issue to deal with, but from my perspective, I think religious and scientific texts and all kinds of thinking needs to be aware that Aristotelian logic is not the complete and final system, that we have to think somehow outside of that box if we want to make some kind of real truth about reality and about experience. I hope that answers the question. Or creates further questions.
Bob, do you want to reply? No? Oh, okay. So, yeah, anyone else?
I do have a question for Eric if others don't.
Yeah. Go ahead. Oh, mics are not able to be unmuted. Oh, okay.
Oh, I'm on.
Technical.
Oh.
So people, but while we work on this, why don't you ask your question, Anna?
Okay, so Eric, you said that the greatest paradox for Jen is that the capital under the rule of the imperial family is caught in chaos. It ought to be exactly otherwise, for the reasons you tell us. So one of the things I noticed in your talk, sorry for the self-indulgence, is how different Jen's attitude toward paradox is to Bernard's, because what you emphasize is that Jen wants to overcome this particular paradox. Bernard, well, I mentioned, is sometimes horrified by paradox, wants in the treatise on which I focus to highlight paradox, not necessarily to overcome it. And one of the things I then wonder is whether in response to this paradox to be overcome, you might think of paradox as a source of enormous creativity along the lines that maybe Kierkegaard suggests, because it's in response to the paradox of the capital and chaos that Jen, as you say, elaborates a new notion of Buddhist deities now assisting in the salvation of vengeful spirits. If I followed you, if I got, am I incorrect? Okay, good. So one, I wonder what you think about paradox as maybe a source of creativity for Jen, and then sort of separate, I actually see another paradox in Jen, and one in your presentation of Jen, and wonder if you would address it, because you talk about the compassion at the end of your talk. You talked about the compassion of the immovable wisdom king, who you said, because he sees all sentient beings as equal, treats vengeful spirits as if they were his only child. So it seems to me, you know, at first blush. There might be a kind of astonishing paradox of a sense of equality of all, funneling a sense of uniqueness. So a paradox of equality and uniqueness perhaps at play. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna, for those questions and comments. So I think that for my presentation today, I really focused on GN's focus on the paradox in society. And I think that definitely that GN uses paradox as a source of creativity. And I think you could say that in his innovation and the way that he's creating his ritual space. And there's also a sense of, I would say, kind of practicality as well. So he highlights paradox in order to justify the creation of his own ritual space. So there's a lot of kind of institutional politics going on as well, which I think is actually quite fascinating, that his ritual program and a lot of the what he's establishing is connected to the way that he highlights the dangers in the world that only he himself can solve. So I think that you can't ignore that aspect of GN as well. But I think when you step into GN's ritual program, which actually wasn't made available to, he didn't publish, this is more directed for his own disciples. I think you do start to see a little bit more of the paradoxical ideas and kind of elaborated more clearly in his treatises. And I think what you mentioned about the equality and the uniqueness of all beings, I think that's a common perception in esoteric Buddhist scripture of the content of enlightenment, of Buddha's enlightenment, is the ability to see the equality and the distinctness at the same time simultaneously. So the practitioners themselves as Buddhas must also be able to do that, to see the world in that very paradoxical way. And I think that, so, you know, again, there's various levels. I think today in the presentation, I focused on kind of the outward paradoxical reality, but within the ritual logic itself, I think there's a lot of paradoxical elements that's not necessarily characteristic of GN himself, but more within this kind of notion of salvation in the esoteric Buddhist tradition. And there's a very common phrase that says "bon no sokubodai," which basically means that desire is the one and the same as enlightenment. So in early forms of Buddhism, desire was something that you needed to reject in order to attain enlightenment. But when you get to the esoteric tradition, desire is only through your understanding that enlightenment and desire are one and the same that you're able to comprehend reality as it truly is according to the esoteric tradition. So I think there's a lot of things about GN's work and more broadly in esoteric Buddhism as it developed in Japan that we can kind of look at and think about the real kind of creativity that comes out of these paradoxical ways of looking at the world. So thank you so much for that question.
Excellent. Steve Mayu has a question for Eric. Go ahead, Steve.
Actually, this is for all three. I was just wondering, in terms of the project, your presentation showed sort of the richness of using the notion of paradox to cover a whole bunch of different things, and so I think that's great, and it allows all kinds of different attempts to use it to understand different cultures, different arguments, etc. I was wondering, maybe this is more directed at Anna. To what extent is it important for the group to differentiate that general heuristic use of paradox and the sort of the technical philosophical history of the term as it's explicitly been discussed in rhetoric and in philosophy? So, for example, you mentioned Kierkegaard. You mentioned I don't know if paradox comes up in the logical debates between Abelard and Bernard. So I was just wondering if someone could respond to that question. Thank you for all the presentations.
Yeah, well, I'll just say a few words and then maybe hand it over to Dermott. One of the things we noticed working together is how difficult it was for us to get a hold of material, philosophical, or in terms of the study of religion, historically or theologically, to get a hold of material that we all thought was really substantive on the topic of paradox, unless I think, at least in my case, it is geared precisely to individual expression. So once you pull out from a study, you might say, of paradox in very particular contexts, things seem to us, we're just starting this project. So what do we know, right? But things seem to us to get pretty slippery and superficial pretty quickly. Which contributes to our difficulty of getting a handle on exactly what we mean by paradox. So I think the three of us are doing what I tried to suggest I was doing in my paper, which is we are simultaneously juggling various notions of paradox. I gave you an example from scripture of Jesus, which I do think speaks to what Bob said about paradox as a way to trigger response that is sometimes emotional, sometimes ethical or moral. And so we're playing with varieties of definitions and examples. I think that eventually, I suppose the three of us would love to get a better handle on what we call the foundation of what we're doing. But I think we're a ways away. And I will say, I don't think Abelard, 12th century brilliant theologian, contemporary of Bernard's, whom he savaged, I don't think that Abelard took up explicitly the notion of paradox, but that was a topic very much taken in terms of the more strict Aristotelian logic to which Dermott refers in late medieval universities. And their treatment, late medieval thinkers in the scholastic context of paradox, is a world apart, it's true, from the preoccupation we see at play in Bernard and frankly in Jen. And so they would have not probably even been attentive to the presence of paradox, as are some modern readers, frankly, in looking at Bernard, where people were excited by Bernard and took off with Bernard's paradoxical thinking was in the so-called mystical tradition. I myself rather hate that word because it's so limiting and unnecessarily distinguished one way of perceiving reality from another, but it also is helpful. So I think the three of us are at a distance. We want to continue to make careful distinctions. And I think Dermott's gone a real distance at helping us do that. But I myself remain quite frustrated, if grateful.
If I could jump in for 1 second and just elaborate on something Anna, some of the topics Anna said. Really amazing to think about these kind of questions, very difficult questions. But so we know that in medieval Europe, people like Duns Scotus and these kind of figures were definitely interested in the formal application of understanding paradox. And this is very different, I think, from Bernard of Clairvaux, who is, as Anna pointed out, more interested in the lived experience, I think, of religious practice. But, we have the development of certain logical theories that actually mimic other developments in Buddhism, the square of opposition, an attempt to actually try to find very similar to what in Buddhism is found in Madhyamaka philosophy, the tetralemma. So we do see medieval scholars trying to wrestle with the formal issues of paradox. And I think what happens is that we start to see an evolution away from formal issues, more closely towards what I might call philosophical logic, something like Hegelian, the idea of the synthesis, the antithesis, the thesis merging into a synthesis. And this became a popular way to express certain paradoxical aspects, I think, that people encountered in reality. So, I think we're really dealing with those 2 or 3 different aspects of paradox: the formal nature of paradox, the lived experience of paradox. And then I think what also Dr. Swanson really brought to the fore was the paradox of, society and the religious practitioner. So we have a series of different paradoxes we're working on. And I think one of the key ideas of this group is to allow all of these to take their own place and to have a voice. So I don't know if anyone wants to respond, or Dr. Swanson would like to jump in or not.
No, thank you. If I could jump in as well, and I think thank you for the question. I think it's a point that we've been kind of grappling with, and I just want to read out to you that one of the books that we read for our study groups, which we found quite useful, was and that Anna also quoted in her presentation, was Matthew Bagger's "The Uses of Paradox: Religion, Self-Transformation, and the Absurd." And in his introduction, I think he does a very useful kind of overview of this notion of paradox. And he specifically argues kind of that this notion of paradox within the tradition of philosophical logic is maybe a limiting way of understanding paradox. And I have it right here, so I'm going to read, I think, an important part of his way of reasoning. So he says, reason, of course, is one form of epistemic authority, but testimony, tradition, and verdicts of recognized specialists or masters, revelation, and divination also have the power to render claims credible. A paradox, as I define it, is apparently absurd claim supported by at least one of these forms of authority. Paradoxes are not mere wordplay, neither are they primarily exercises in logic. So I think this is a very useful reflection on paradox that's been very useful for me, and I think for all of us in thinking about the potential of paradox. And then also, I think Anna mentioned this question, I think a really important question of who is the paradox for whom, right? And I think both for Gian and for Bernard, it's not paradoxical for them, right? Because there's a certain logic to the way that they're approaching these issues. But going back to, I think in the question, the heuristic use of paradox, and I think specifically in what we're trying to do in the study group as interreligious dialogue, how can we use paradox as a way to communicate across traditions? I think that's kind of what we're really interested in thinking about as we move forward. So thank you again for the question.
Thank you.
If you could share, Eric, the citation. It's a question that is now in the chat.
Okay, sure. So I will include the name of the book in the chat, and
Thank you so much. Do we have any raised hands?
Jose, can I jump in very quickly?
Oh, yes, please, John.
It's fascinating listening to this discussion of the frustrations that emerge and even talking about this and the kind of intellectual history of paradox and the different dimensions in which we experience or encounter it that Eric's just summed up for us. And the very topic itself is so striking because we, of course, are all products of our own cultural milieu and our own intellectual lineage here, where paradox is sort of remarkable to us because it butts up against these sort of classical notions of logic that we have so deeply ingrained. And yet, as Anna, you mentioned in your discussion earlier, Christianity certainly is a religion founded on paradox, whether it's the Virgin or whether it's Jesus, or whether it's in the century after Bernard, the formalization of transubstantiation, which is the sort of the ultimate expression of kind of theological paradox at this point in time, which people were just kind of willing to roll along with in a way that, and not all of them, of course, there are certainly debates about this kind of thing. But it's so interesting to just have this framed for us in a way. And I can't help but think, as we're doing this under the auspices of the Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination, this is really more just a comment than a question, but to almost sort of grieve the loss of imagination that certainly within Christianity we've experienced, where in some way there's been a kind of a hardening of, to go back to Dermott's remark, a kind of a hardening of these Aristotelian categories, right, in contemporary, certainly lived Catholic experience. Dermott was talking earlier about the binaries of gender, for instance, or these kinds of things, which ultimately all go back to Aristotle, and which have now become sort of so reified and so inflexible in our conversations in ways that Bernard, certainly thinking about gender, chief among folks in the Middle Ages, was certainly inhabiting all of these interesting gender categories that existed between the poles. So it's not, again, not a question, but just an appreciation for the way in which this has made me more attentive to to a kind of a loss that I think we've experienced sort of post-Enlightenment within contemporary, certainly Catholic and Christian theology. And I'm just really grateful for your sort of kind of resuscitating an interest in this way of thinking and a recognition that this isn't inherently problematic, but it's just wonderfully generative and imaginative in the way that I think, you know, ACTI is here to remind us of, right, the importance of imagination and all this. So just I really am grateful for your remarks. Thank you all.
Thank you, John. Yes, I guess it's 12:30. One last comment, one last observation. Jesse, I just appeared. Do you have a question? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I do. It's not a great ending question, so my apologies. I did not realize we were ending here, but yeah,
we can push it to the end forward if we need it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I had a quick question for Eric, and I think hopefully it sort of ties together some of these broader discussions of paradox and sort of the intellect, sort of philosophical nature and the sort of lived sort of social nature discussed in the talk. But does Gian also give a sort of more intellectual explanation, in a sense, for the paradox of the authority of the divine ruler and the chaos in the realm? So there's this sort of the natural contingency of history and the sort of the malevolent spirits that you're sort of discussing in sort of pacified and ritual give a sort of that right sort of social sort of answer of medicine and a solution, but it doesn't seem to answer the problem of why this happens. Why, you know, if governance is happening properly with a divine ruler, why are there these malevolent spirits that need to be sort of solved by ritual? I know sort of you're moving away from the sort of past scholarship on GN discussing this more intellectual knowledge view of history, but I'm curious if you could just sort of address that quickly.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. It's great to see you too. Thanks for zooming in today. So I think the quick answer to the question is that unfortunately there is really very little kind of philosophical reflection on this notion, and I think that's one reason why people were so puzzled. Previous scholars were so puzzled with his weaving of these vengeful spirits within his historical treatise. And oftentimes it was just kind of brushed aside as, other than this kind of notion of vengeful spirits, it's a very philosophically solid work or historical work, because he never really elaborates on it. And I wish that there was a treatise where he kind of elaborates on it in a more clear way. But I think the missing picture is that for GN, the logic is not in the philosophical writing or the doctrine, but it's in the rituals themselves, right? And I think that recognition, I think, allows us to talk about vengeful spirits in a more kind of productive way, rather than just saying that this doesn't fit into his more historical discussion, for example. So that would be kind of my response. And I think maybe going back to just the earlier point of rethinking, you know, Gian and what he's doing, I certainly don't think that we should return, you know, kind of, you know, responding to our own kind of current political climate. I don't think we should establish pacification of vengeful spirit rituals. You know, that's not. But I think what is fascinating to me and is that there is a kind of generative creativity and an imagination and a logic that's very different from our own, which I think is very hopefully very you know, productive for us to reflect on in our own historical moment. So thank you for your question, Jesse.
Yes, please. I don't want to be the one that actually stops the conversation. If people are interested, that we can keep going on. That's up to you guys. So, well, can I ask something? Unless there's someone else for me, because I already went once. This is a little bit on the Temple of Great Repentance. How, if there is like this, if there is a connection between Japan and Buddhism and architecture, the virtuosity of the distribution of space in terms of architecture, Because it seems that there's an association with a place and the design of the place to redistribute and break the imbalance of forces. I'm wondering if it's only privative of Japan, or it's actually shared in monastical architecture in Western civilization. If there's like a consciousness directly directed towards solving the paradox of reality, as Anna actually mentioned. Reality is really paradoxical. So if architecture and this redistribution of space actually plays an important role.
Can I comment on the Japanese situation first? So one thing that I didn't get to talk about, but I think the just redistribution of space and architecture is really key, or actually quite interesting to think about in Jian's case. So a lot of the rituals that he's establishing at this new temple of great repentance was initially practiced in the northeastern direction, where Mount Hiei was located. And this is dates back to very basic ancient Chinese ways of looking at the world, where the northeastern direction was the gate of the demons. So, you know, the fact that the temple is established on this mountain is very, you know, there's a certain logic behind it. And I think the way that Jian is transferring a lot of the rituals that were in the kind of in the distance in the mountains in the northeastern direction, and then just reestablishing it right in the proximity of the capital is significant. That space, the shift in this space, and it reflects what I think he's trying to do again with highlighting vengeful spirits as you know, accelerating social disorder. I have, and I'm unaware of the Western situation in terms of the architectural space. So maybe I'll turn it over to Anna if you have something to say.
Yeah, I don't think Anna can contribute much to the topic. I might bring up something else, but I don't know if I'm interrupting or just.
No.
Okay, so you know, this is in part a response to the question and observation of Steve and John, and so I just want to say that so one of the things we clearly have not done in our small but beautiful medieval monasticism group, which by the way has been the most joyous experience for me, and I'm so grateful to my colleagues. What we haven't done is said we've got to figure out what we're doing before we do it. We have a hint of what we want to do. And frankly, I don't know that that's a bad method, because in part what we're signaling is our openness to the material we're treating to teach us something. So I think as historians, because the three of us are historians, although some of us also have cultivated a philosophical, scholarly bent, but as historians, I do think we're doing what we're supposed to do, which is be really open to the past and to learn from our texts what it is we should be paying attention to. And the reason paradox is working so well for us as scholars, as historians, is because I think it's helping us to see material in our texts. And by texts, I mean written texts and architecture, etc. It's helping us to see stuff to which we might not otherwise have been sensitive. And I think, to draw on something that John has said, this is in part what it means, I think, for us to cultivate our imagination, right? To be open to seeing, you know, as I think Kierkegaard and others have suggested, to be open to all sorts of surprises in the past and frankly in the present. So I think a sense of paradox is just frankly helping us be better readers of a complex reality at a distance from us. And on that note, I do want to invite all of you who are interested in paradox or in the 12th century or Buddhism or Catholicism or all of the above to sort of stay with us, because we're having a symposium this spring, but in the fall, we'll have another probably on paradox, which will be much more blown open to invite people from varieties of fields, exploring a diversity of topics. So we very much are committed to continuing this book conversation because it's been so fun.
Excellent. So anyone else?
Jose, could I just add one final thing, and John Sebastian's going to hear an echo of something I suggested to him, that when you're thinking about it in this heuristic way, I think rhetorical theory might be something that'd be really interesting, and in particular, Kenneth Burke and his grammar of motives. He talks about the paradox of substance. And then in his follow-up book, Rhetoric of Motives, he actually depends upon Richard McKeon's History of Medieval Rhetoric and quotes Bernard there. And so I think there would be some interesting relationships to what you're doing, and could actually be specific to Anna, your work on Bernard.
100% I'm getting the book to which you just brought our attention. Very grateful. By the way, one of the 3 best writings on the paradoxical dimension of Bernard comes from a historian who used to be at Rutgers, who looks at his rhetoric in one text having to do with the papacy.
Yeah.
So I think I kind of know you're right, and know that's an area for investigation. So I'm very much looking forward to finding Burke. Thanks a million.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you.
So I would really like to thank everyone here and for making this such an engaging conversation. And obviously ACTI is more than willing to keep on, propelling this kind of interaction in our community. And I will just please follow our events in our website. This is going to be posted. This conversation will be posted as soon as it's ready from the Zoom cloud. And I will just leave Eric and Anna and Dermott with just some last thoughts, last words, please, so we can conclude our event today. Anna, do you want to give us some last thoughts?
Yeah, I do really principally want to thank Eric and Dermott, of course, Emmylou and Jose and all of you, but to again say that there's something that's been remarkably, to me, stimulating about working with colleagues in a shared area of interest that once again helps me become more careful about the work I do. And they have opened up for me, two historians of medieval Japanese Buddhism, dimensions of my own Christian monk's thought. And for that, I am enormously grateful. So thank you both. And thank you, Jose and Emmylou.
If I could just say a couple of words, I like to echo thanks to Emmylou and Jose for hosting us, and also I think stimulating and fun is another word I think that I heard before, and that's my sentiment of working on this project in this study group, and it's just been invigorating and so much fun to really think about the possibilities of interreligious dialogue as historians. So I really look forward to keeping this discussion going, and I want to thank everybody here for taking the time to join us today. So thank you.
If I could, finish it off, I suppose, and just echo what my colleagues have said. Emmylou and Jose have given us this opportunity. Thank you so much, and to Dr. Swanson and to Dr. Harrison, for me to have a chance to study with you, to learn from you, has been really a privilege. I think LMU is very, very strong actually in Asian philosophical and religious studies, and it creates a great opportunity to develop a really worthwhile comparative frameworks for the study of religion. And I think hopefully today was kind of a good example of that. I certainly can say I'm really appreciative to everyone who turned up and for all the thoughts and comments. So thank you very, very much.
Okay, thank you. And I hope that I was able to actually tell you, join me in the garden for some cocktails, but I can't, but we will do it next year. Okay, so bye everyone.